What do you know about politics? What should you know? Forget views, beliefs, and opinions. Politics is really a science, and that's where we come in. Welcome to Inside Political Science. I'm Kirby Goodell.
I'm Todd Kent, and we're your guides to what's actually happening in politics. We're using our years of experience to navigate political data, media, money, behavior, and more to educate and inform you.
Welcome to episode 5. I'm Kirby Goodell. I'm a professor of political science in the Bush School of Government and Public Service at Texas A&M University. Todd Kent is not with us today. He's out in Europe with a group of Texas A&M students, teaching them about European politics. And instead, I have with me my good friend, Bill Clark. Bill and I came to Texas A&M at the same time. One of the great things about being at Texas A&M was getting to meet Bill, getting to talk politics. Bill came to Texas A&M from Michigan. He got his PhD at Rutgers University. He's an expert on comparative political economy, international political economy, and we wanted to talk a little bit about what's going on in the economy right now in the U.S., and I couldn't think of anybody I'd rather talk to than Bill. Also, we don't always agree on things, do we?
That's for sure.
Did I leave? Oh, I should also throw out there, Bill's an incredible musician. He's also hosted programs on jazz and a great jazz guitarist and bass player and lots of other cool things going on.
Thanks for that kind introduction. It's great to be here with you, Kirk.
Yeah, and one of my favorite people to talk to. So we are going to talk about the economy. We're going to talk about what's going on with the economy. We're going to talk about control of the economy and political control of the economy. But first, we're going to go into some quick takes on what's happening now. As always, remember, if you have a question, send it to us at insidepolisci, POLISCI, at tamu.edu. So let's get into our quick takes. And Bill, I'm going to start. One of the things that I want to brand is this seems to me to be the everything, everywhere, all at once election. It's so close, the country's so divided that everything seems to matter. Even the smallest little differences seem to matter, which presents a problem to us as political scientists in terms we like to find causes, and we like to know that the evidence is overwhelming in support of the cause. But where there's lots of things going on and everything seems to matter at the margins, the world's trickier, right?
It is trickier. I mean, another way of responding to the fact that everything matters is that nothing matters.
Yes. Yes.
So it makes it very hard to know how to engage, that's for sure.
Yeah. Well, one of the big events of the last week was the Trump conviction. I will admit I was more than a little surprised in terms of the resounding nature of the conviction. If you had asked me, I would have said I would be willing to bet on a mixed verdict. He'll be guilty of some of the counts, but not all the 34 of the counts. Or that there might be a hung jury, because surely in a group of 12 there might be one person there who's hanging on to a not guilty verdict. But instead, it was pretty overwhelming.
Yeah, absolutely, and swift.
Yeah, but we get into this interesting piece here that people want to think and imagine that Trump's the first person to run for office as a convicted felon. He's really not. He's the first major party nominee. Eugene Debs. Once upon a time, I was at Indiana State University, which is located in Terre Haute. The Eugene Debs house is there. That's where Eugene Debs is from. Eugene Debs ran in 1920 from a prison cell, convicted of violating the Sedition Act of 1918.
That's right. An important difference between Trump and Eugene Debs is that history has not been very kind to the Sedition Act.
Yes.
Right? So Debs was guilty of violating something that constitutionally was extremely tenuous, and in retrospect it seemed to be a pretty clear violation of the Constitution. So that leaves the sort of historical record on Debs with respect to this particular felony charge quite different than I think the Trump case.
Yeah, and Debs, very much unlike President Trump, didn't claim the process was rigged against him, even though it it was an unconstitutional act, and history was much kinder to him. He went to prison. He said, "I asked no mercy. I asked no immunity." His sentence was later commuted by Warren Harding, and of course later the act itself was found to be unconstitutional.
Yeah, so it was really an act of civil disobedience that he was engaged in, and he had enough respect for the institutions and the law to know that playing within the rules would, at the end, increase the likelihood that the kind of institutional change that he sought happened. Again, a very different situation than the Trump case, where the whole point seems to be to call the legitimacy in the institutions into play.
Yeah, and then we do have a couple others. I don't think we want to go into too much detail. Lyndon LaRouche in the 1990s and 1992, guilty of fraud, and Joseph Smith, head of the Church of Latter-day Saints, also charged with treason and running from a jail cell. We don't know if Trump will be running from a jail cell, and we don't
mental image,
and we don't know whether that will help him or hurt him politically. But that's sort of our next question. Do you think this helps or hurts political Trump? I know this is a lot of speculation where we don't have a lot of good evidence, because
it seems to me it's got to weakly hurt him. That it's either going to have no effect or it's going to hurt him. The only way I can imagine it helping him, because certainly friends in my Facebook feed from the town I grew up in responded instantly with statements like, "I'm more MAGA than ever." So it could certainly create a kind of cause celeb for him among his followers. But we got to imagine those people were voting for him anyway. So I don't see anybody that it would cause that was uncertain about whether they would vote for Trump to suddenly support him. That's what I mean by it would weakly hurt him, because I can imagine some traditional conservative Republicans, if they actually believe the conservative pro-institution ideology that they espouse, how being named a felon would make them more inclined to vote for him, and it might cause some people to vote against him. It might affect turnout, right? There might be some people who were pro-supporters who might be energized to vote at the margins where they wouldn't otherwise. But other than through the turnout channel, I don't see how it could help them.
Yeah, the only other thing I would add there is immediately in the aftermath, and I think you get it exactly right, that what we see is this is a base effect. This rallies the base. Yeah. This makes the people who believe in the MAGA movement and believe in Donald Trump, it fires them up, it engages them, they're excited, angry.
Certainly got their checkbooks out.
That's the thing. They got their checkbooks out. They raised an incredible amount of money. Their website crashed because so many people were coming in and trying to contribute. So in that way, it may be a net positive. But I agree. I think if we're looking at anything, we're talking about it's most likely to have an effect at the margins.
Yeah.
But in this really close election cycle, those margins matter. So if it just makes a few Republicans decide either to vote for Joe Biden or to not vote, or it moves a few independents, and especially we've been talking a lot in polling about these double haters, people who don't want Biden or Trump, and they're either going to not vote or they're going to go in one of the camps, and it might move just enough of those in order to be decisive, especially in some of these swing states that may matter.
Well, the swing state is the key thing, right? Yeah. It matters where these effects happen. We've learned that popular vote doesn't count for very much at this point in our history. It really matters what happens in those few electoral college relevant swing states.
Yeah, and a lot of what will matter in terms of how this plays out will be how the campaigns deal with it. I think Trump's got an easier task. He claims the process is rigged. He set up this idea that the process is rigged against him for so long that, finally, I guess he's had other evidence that he can throw to his supporters. This seems to support that claim. On the Biden camp, it's a little trickier. They have to be a little uncertain about whether to really play this up. Or to play it down and focus on other types of issues.
Right.
So.
Yeah. I think that, Biden's initial response seemed to be a pretty careful and level-headed one to focus on the the challenge to the institutions,
Yes.
and the fact that Trump's camp seems to be cutting to the very core of the legitimacy of our institutions, and how that's a dangerous strategy, and it should be the Democratic position is to just fight against that challenge to legitimacy rather than get involved in retrying the case or anything like that.
Meanwhile, the Biden camp has its own sort of legal issue with Hunter Biden. I don't think we really need to get into that, other than just to say that it has the potential to diminish some of the concern about corruption or bad behavior on the Trump side. Unless you want to add something, what I'm more interested in, I think, is Biden has come out to be more aggressive on the border.
Yeah.
And we know that in politics, parties often own issues. Republicans have owned the immigration issue. Does Biden risk just walking into an issue that's not that favorable to him?
Yeah, I mean, this seems like classic kind of Downsian convergence, right? So for our viewers, there are theories in politics that say in a two-party system like ours, the parties ought to match policy proposals. There shouldn't be any difference between the parties on key issues that are of concern to voters. And of course, we live in a period where it's much more common to point to growing polarization between the parties. It's interesting to see on this issue the Biden administration to try to match the Trump position to take it off of Trump's list of things he can attack the president on. It seems like it's a little too late, and he's not going to be immune to charges that some voters see as a bad policy on the border. So it's hard to know whether, like I said, my sense is it's too little too late, and if anything, it just kind of erodes his credibility and makes it seem like he's willing to say whatever's necessary to get elected.
Yeah, my first immediate reaction was, okay, that's if you what you want to do is you want to take away an advantage of the opponent. That seems like a really smart political play, but it does seem like it should have happened 6 months ago, a year ago, maybe, and especially when he should have followed up the failed legislative package that Trump helped to undermine in terms of securing the border. He could have followed that up, right? And he could have said right away, they're not going to take action. I will. And it seemed like that was an opportune time to do it. So the timing is a little weird to me, other than we did just have an election in Mexico. Do you think that played into the decision and the timing? I'm
not sure why it would. I mean, my understanding is most of the cross-border flow northward is coming from people south of Mexico, not Mexico.
Right.
So there is this long-standing idea that our immigration issues, our problems are in a sense a result of a lack of development or democracy in our southern neighbors, and therefore we ought to be concerned about what happens there. But the Mexican election is really a continuity result, right?
Yeah.
There's no big change happening there. So why that would prompt the Biden administration for a change in policy now seems curious to me. I should say that I have a lot less concern for border problems than most people. As a political economist, I think most of the world's problems would be solved by opening borders, not closing them. But I clearly recognize that I'm out of step with a lot of voters on that.
Well, and we're going to get into some of these issues about the economy, and I think that's a really important one. There have been a number of analyses, and I find them pretty convincing, and I'm guessing you find them more convincing, that show that one of the reasons the economy has done pretty well is because we have had an immigration flow.
Yeah. And
if you stop that immigration flow, then you in turn hurt the economy and you hurt the growth that's been going on.
I think that's right. We've been extremely ambiguous in our immigration policy for decades now. What we want, it seems to be, is the best of both worlds. We want to claim that we're being restrictive, but we actually want workers to come in and fill these positions.
Yeah.
And a cynical take on that is some business owners want them to come in illegally so that they can fill the positions without the protections that they might otherwise have.
Yeah, there's a real dichotomy there that I see is where at the one hand you see people complain that we're lacking workers and we're lacking quality workers and that things can't move quick enough, and at the same time we're complaining that we're bringing people in, and we'll talk about that. I think that's a good place to take the break, because that brings us to the economy. In our next segment, we're going to do a deep dive. We're going to talk about what's going on in the economy, why Brett Biden isn't credit, whether he deserves credit, and lots more.
Aggie Land is about to get its own cooking competition as Texas A&M's best chefs compete for the crown in Aggie Chef Showdown. From deconstructed enchiladas to Maryland crab cakes, each chef brings flavors from their childhood to the kitchen. With an hour on the clock and 3 hungry judges waiting, which dish will win? Watch June 10th on KAMU's YouTube channel.
In a state the size of Texas, it takes a team of journalists across the Lone Star State to stay on top of what's making news. From the environment to education, politics to policymaking, business, the arts, culture, and much more. We get you up to speed on what's happening in Texas each Monday through Friday. I'm David Brown, inviting you to make us part of your own news routine and join us for the next edition of the Texas Standard. Weekday mornings at 10 on Aggieland's Public Radio, KAMU FM.
Want a sneak peek of what's new on KAMU each month? Subscribe to our email newsletter, a free exclusive preview of what's to come, featuring monthly updates on new and returning TV and radio shows, binge-worthy KAMU Passport programs, and community events for you to attend. It's the best way to stay up to date on all things KAMU TV and FM. Visit tx.ag/KAMU newsletter and subscribe today.
So Bill is a political communication, campaigns and elections guy. I think a lot about the economy because it's so important to political campaigns. But I generally think of it like if I'm teaching in a classroom, I'm talking about the economy as providing the context for the election. And it sets the boundaries around what's possible in terms of what the campaigns can and can't do. You think about it a little differently.
Yeah. I mean, I've spent 4 decades now thinking about the connection between the polity and the economy. And, there's causal arguments that go both ways. The economics affects politics, politics affects economics. I don't know. I may be a dangerous person to talk to because it seems after 40 years, I'm about as confused as I was when I started.
well, that's why we especially wanted to talk to you, because it's confusing, and a lot of things about what we know have shifted, and I think part of it's because maybe we were a little bit wrong. Maybe our theories or our understandings of the world were a little bit off, but also the world has changed, right?
Yeah, no, it has changed, and what? I guess maybe a good place to start is the traditional understanding of the way the economy might affect politics. I mean, a lot of my early work was on what we call political business cycles. This idea that there's a link between the state of the economy and election outcomes, right? So the most traditional view is what might be called the economic voting view, that people look at the economy and they basically ask themselves, am I better off than I was 4 years ago?
Right.
And if the answer to that is yes, that inclines them to vote for the incumbent. When the answer to that is no, that inclines them to vote against the incumbent. And knowledge of that, if the people who are in office want to stay in office, then that should induce them to behave a certain way when they're in office. If they have levers at their disposal that can affect people's answer to that question, whether they're better off now than they were 4 years ago, they ought to try to produce macroeconomic outcomes that incline people to vote for them. That's all well and good. That's another word for that might be democratic accountability, right? We would want governments to try to produce, to the extent that their behavior affects the economy, they might want to produce good economic outcomes. But certain behaviors, we might say maybe deviations from rationality in the voters might incline incumbents to vote to manipulate the economy in ways that aren't good in some general welfare sense. One is that voters appear to be what we call myopically retrospective. They care more about recent performance than earlier performance, and if that's true, then that might cause governments to want to try to produce sort of rapid expansions in macroeconomic activity right before the election that gets rewarded by these myopically retrospective voters, and but at the cost of future inflation. So there's unfortunately, the evidence for all of this stuff is hotly contested, both in the United States and abroad. And then there's this whole other channel of ways of thinking about the macroeconomy and the polity that's called the partisan model, that says that parties have different constituencies. The traditional view in the United States is that the Republican Party have capital owners and rich people, if you will, as their natural constituency, and Democrats have workers as their natural constituency, and that should induce governments to produce different kinds of macroeconomic outcomes. A lot of growth by Democrats, and price stability is the traditional area of concern for the Republican constituency. Again, there's not a lot of evidence in support of that. That traditional view has conservative or Republican parties as being fiscally conservative inflation hawks, and Democrats as tax and spend liberals. The actual empirical record suggests that there's no evidence for that. Ronald Reagan could run up a deficit with the best of them, despite all the talk about fiscal conservatism. So the sort of traditional models don't fit particularly well with the data, but they still seem to inform the way people talk about politics. This myth of Republican fiscal conservatism is resilient and seems impervious to evidence. And the idea that the Democrats are tax and spend liberals is not consistent with the data. There's been recent reports in the paper that the progressivity of the income tax in the Biden administration is no better than it was before he took office. So there's a lot of myth and a lot of standard way of understanding things that doesn't seem well supported by the data.
Well, do you think how much of that is because the world once worked in a particular way, and now we live in a more globalized world? It's a world where goods are moving back and forth much easier. We've talked about in a local community, you have access to a much wider variety of services and goods and products than once upon a. Were the theories right at one point, and now they're maybe just not capturing the way that the economy's changed and the way that the flow of money and the flow of the...
That's a very common viewpoint, right? The idea is that there once was a time when governments controlled, in the post-World War II period when capital wasn't mobile and the economy was essentially a closed economy. One could imagine that the actions of the government would have a much more predictable and pronounced effect on economic outcomes, and that as capital became mobile, as trade became a more important part of the economy, as the economies become globalized, the room for maneuver of governments has gotten smaller. That's the standard argument. Yeah. I wrote a book 20 years ago that says that's wrong, that even from 1960 to 1980, there wasn't a dime's bit of difference in macroeconomic outcomes between left-wing governments and right-wing governments in OECD countries, of which the U.S. is just one example. Now, almost nobody agrees with that book. So, I'm a minority voice here. But I think that the data is pretty clear. I mean, there's some ways in which the spending priorities of the parties might have been different. But there's been, in the big macroeconomic indicators, like the size of the deficit, and there's not a dime's worth of difference between parties to the left and parties to the right. I'll maintain that today. I think that there's a lot of reasons why people resist that outcome, mostly because I think political scientists get in the business because they have this idea if they could just elect the right people, everything will be okay. Right. And my results suggest, no, that doesn't really, it's not that easy.
So we want to talk about the state of the economy today, but before we do that, let me throw this out there because I think what you're saying is fascinating, and I find the whole topic fascinating. So could I infer from what you're saying that at least in terms of economic outcomes, it may not make as much of a difference whether we elect Biden or Trump as most people think it
I hate
would.
To say it, but yeah, I think that's exactly right. And actually, I sleep well at night because of that. I mean, I think there are structural constraints, there are institutional constraints on policy making, and then there's the whole. I mean, one thing that's true is that markets can veto the actions of governments, and governments know that, and that forces convergence between the parties. The only thing that's different between me and the current people is I think that was true in the closed economy as well as in the open economy. James Carville famously said that if there's reincarnation, he wants to come back as the bond market, because everybody's afraid of the bond market. I think that's true. I think the government gets out of bed in the morning thinking about the way asset holders are going to respond to their policies, and that forces governments of all stripes to act in basically the same way. That means who we elect doesn't matter, and if you think democracy is good because it gives us these alternative visions and the opportunity to experiment with different policies, that's bad. But I think it keeps governments in this kind of feasibility zone and making policies that, when we talk about where the economy is today, has produced long-term pretty good macroeconomic performance. So I'm happy with the idea that the government can't monkey around with the economy too much.
Yeah. So and that. Let's take the step back now and talk about where the economy is, because there's this question that, and especially on the Biden side, there seems to be a lot of frustration. The economy is so much better than people think it is. Why aren't we getting credit for it? This is good. It's objectively good. It's good by inflation rates, by growth rates, by all sorts of unemployment rates, by all sorts of indicators. If it's so good, why isn't he getting credit? Or what's going on in the political economic interaction?
Yeah, no, I mean, first, I think it's important to say it is good, right? Yeah. I mean, Biden took office at the tail of the biggest economic shock, an unanticipated economic shock in the form of the COVID pandemic that's happened since the since October 1929, right? Yeah. So it was a huge economic shock, and it had a lot of dislocation. Most of that occurred under Trump's watch. And then time since then, the economy is basically back on trend. It's growing at about 3%, which is the post-war success story, right? Inflation is about 3%, and yet everybody seems to think the world is falling apart. And I don't know why that's the case, right? So one thing we know from the literature, I said before that people evaluate the economy and answer the question, am I better off than I was 4 years ago? We know that people interpret or arrive at that answer in an extremely biased way, right? People have a tendency to forgive bad economic performance if the party they associate with is in power, and they tend to unreasonably punish the government for economic performance when their party that they don't associate with is in power. But that wouldn't explain why, on average, people seem to say that the economy is doing badly. It would say why Republicans are not giving Biden credit. But it seems there's a fair amount of evidence Democrats aren't given. They're not even giving Biden credit for the performance he has, let alone the standard tendency to be biased, to have a biased attribution in his favor. And we don't really know why that's the case. I could speculate, but it's a pretty persistent puzzle.
Yeah, but we also know that despite the sort of strong economic signals, that there are issues, right? And so, for example, inflation was pretty high during the post-COVID period, and even if it's now more under control, the prices haven't gone back. They're just growing at a slower rate. And so if you are and if you're trying to buy a home, you might be running into problems in terms of getting a good interest rate. And if you could have bought a home in 2019 for the same price you can today, you're still going to pay a lot more for it because of interest rates. So people who are in that stage of their lives are especially affected. People going out in the job market, it may be jobs are plentiful, but what kind of jobs, at what wage, at what sort of how are people thinking about it in terms of their ability to think about the future? So I guess this it comes to sort of two questions. Are our standard economic indicators missing something that's going on that's really important in the economy, where what I'm feeling and what I'm experiencing in my day-to-day life isn't what's reflected in the signals? Or are we just kind of a problem? Or are our expectations set too high by past positive economic performance, say during the Obama administration or the Clinton administration, where the economy was in the first part of the Trump administration, where the economy was really booming and interest rates were low and jobs seemed plentiful and everybody seemed to be doing really well? And were we just spoiled?
No, I don't think we were spoiled. I think you're right that the good economic performance that's happening now, 3% growth, roughly 3% inflation, is the result of policies that the Fed has pursued in the past couple of years, which have been quite in line with this notion of an independent central bank that's an inflation hawk. So the reason they were able to whip inflation was they were willing to keep interest rates high. Mm-hmm. And that's not costless, right? It reduces labor mobility because it makes people more reluctant to sell their house in one place and move to another place to get a job, which creates all kinds of rigidities in the labor market and contributes to stagnant real wages. So the good economic performance wasn't a magic trick. It was something that was conducted in a very straightforward way by the Fed that has economic consequences. Mm-hmm. The other thing that I've been thinking about recently is that it's the case that per capita GDP is growing, but that tells you how the average person in society is doing. Right. It doesn't tell you what the median person's life is like. And the recent, we know that the past 30 years have been a period of rapidly growing economic inequality in the U.S., and that would tend to drive a wedge between what the average person is experiencing. We're getting good signals that per capita GDP is growing with what the median person is experiencing. With greater inequality, the average worker might not be doing as well as the median worker is not doing as well as the mean worker is doing, and that leaves a lot of people in a position where they have things to complain about with respect to the economy. And, political psychologists, this is really more your bailiwick than mine, but I'm convinced by the idea that people are biased in the way they attribute their own economic outcomes. So when they're doing well, they think I'm smart and productive, and the economy's great because it's rewarding somebody as smart and productive as I am.
Yeah.
When they're doing poorly in terms of their individual, either in terms of their individual economic circumstances or in the local economy that they find themselves in, they tend to look around for an explanation outside themselves. And so if I'm doing poorly, it's not because I, show up to work late or I drink too much and therefore I'm not productive. It's because the economy is bad. Mm-hmm. And maybe the economy is bad because the government is bad. So the rise in income inequality might leave more people today casting around for an explanation outside themselves than was the case in the past. And that might explain why even Democrats are failing to give Biden the credit that past voters might have attributed. Whether when the economy was booming in the past it was rational for voters to attribute that to the president's performance is a whole nother question that we didn't get into.
Yeah, and so as a political matter, it may not be in the best. I don't know exactly how the Biden camp wants to tackle this problem, because I do buy the economic evidence that the economy is doing better than I think most people realize. But if I come to you and you're not feeling like the economy is doing well, and I say, "What's wrong with you? The economy is doing fine," politically, that doesn't seem like a winner.
Yeah, no, that's for sure. To compound matters, to the extent that that government policy actually affects the real economy. Mm-hmm. In economics departments, that's not a given. There's lots and lots of Nobel laureates who have gotten their acclaim by making arguments that policy basically has nothing other than transitory effects on how the economy is doing. I think now we're in a consensus where we think policy does matter, but it matters with a pretty serious lag.
Yeah.
Right? If the Fed changes interest rates today, that's going to affect real output a year, maybe 18 months from now. So the idea that if Nobel laureates can't accurately ascertain the effect of policy on outcomes, how voters are able to make that judgment is a point of some mystery.
Yeah, but if policy is not having an impact, is that part because of the and you said this is true across country, so it wouldn't be, it's not just particular to the U.S., but is that because of structural obstacles of, I know you're an expert and a leading expert on central banks and the Federal Reserve. Is it really because the Federal Reserve is protecting us from the bad politicians?
Well, that's part of what's going on. Although my work suggests that the Fed doesn't protect us in an unbiased way. My own work suggests that if the Fed really is concerned about fighting inflation, when Democrats are up for re-election, they can act like a good independent central bank. There's nothing that stops them from telling a Democratic president who's trying to engineer a pre-electoral macroeconomic expansion that they can say no to that and set interest rates low. What's a little bit less intuitive is that if Republicans share policy preferences with the Fed, that their ideal inflation rate is closer to what the Fed thinks than Democrats, and that is the standard partisan model, then when Republicans ask for a lower interest rate in the pre-electoral period, the Fed might say yes to that, because if they say no to it, what's going to happen is they're going to get the Republican thrown out of office and they'll put a Democrat in office. And because I believe central bank independence is partial, that is, they always have to compromise with the president that's in power. When the Republicans are up for re-election, they have to decide, do I compromise a little bit with the Republicans now so I don't have to compromise a lot with the Democrats later?
Yeah.
And if that's true, then what happens is we get tight monetary policy prior to elections only when Democrats are in office. Yeah. And there's considerable evidence that that's exactly how the Fed acts, and that explains why Republicans seem to be able to pull off pre-electoral expansions better than Democrats do.
So going into this election cycle, again, is this a fair interpretation? The Fed would be reluctant to act on interest rates because we do have a Democrat in office.
Yes.
If Biden were a Republican, they might have been willing to lower interest rates because they would have perceived that at least that the Republican policy was closer to their preferences and more
That's right.
anti-inflationary.
Our model and data based on from 1950 to 2008, when I think, says that's exactly the way the world works.
Yeah.
It seems to still be working that way, even though there's lots of reasons to believe it shouldn't, right?
Yeah.
Republicans and Democrats don't seem to mean the same thing they meant 10 or 15 years ago.
Yeah.
But if the Fed still believes in that traditional partisan model, then that would explain why the Fed actually had relatively low interest rates early in Biden's, and then have systematically raised them, which is exactly what our model would predict.
Yeah. But it's really because if you look at sort of the policy statements of a Donald Trump or even Joe Biden, neither one of them seem really designed to limit inflation. Is that
right.
fair?
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. So
and especially on tariffs.
Trump
right?
isn't a traditional, doesn't even talk the talk of a fiscal conservative, right? So yeah, it's the puzzle from my viewpoint would be why the Fed continues to classify Trump in that way. The other thing that's absolutely amazing is there's a lot of people in Trump's camp that talk about if he gets reelected, they're going to try to do away with the independence of the Fed, which is crazy talk because under the current circumstances, the Fed seems to be acting in a way that greatly favors Trump.
So on the positive side, if we do away with the independence of the Fed, maybe we have policy matter more and politics matter more, but the structural protections of the economy, the things that have given us this long period of economic growth, this very strong economy with some obvious problems in between the recessions and the 2009 and 2008 and the COVID crisis. There are some problems that pop up, but over a long span of time, the economy's been pretty strong.
That's exactly right. So the central puzzle in America, for me as a political economist, is, central bank independence is in some ways deeply anti-democratic. It allows the Fed to put its thumb on the scale to elect Republican presidents. But its ability to do so may have also created the kind of investor confidence and stability that led to the post-war economic growth. The Fed became operationally independent right when the post-war economic boom happened. It's, in some sense, it's a kind of social contract that hardwires into our government the policy preferences of the property classes, which Marx's views of our Constitution suggest that was the case from the beginning, right? Our system was designed to protect property owners from the vagaries of demagoguery that they thought would happen in a democracy.
And how do you think this is a serious worry that we might undermine the independence of the Fed, or do you think this is just one of those, we throw it out there because how, as a political economist, how worried are you about the independence of the Federal Reserve?
Not terribly.
Okay.
I think that there's always been attacks on the independence of the Fed, and there's been calls for this. So far, our institutions seem to be holding, although, the attacks on the liberal, that means free trade economic order of the post-war period seem to be open to challenge. And that I do take very seriously. If the institutions that gave us the good economic performance are eroded, then there's going to be a high cost in terms of human suffering. So I'd like to think our institutions are safe. I think it's extremely important to think our institutions are safe, but I think it probably behooves us to be vigilant in making sure that they're protected.
Yeah. Well, on that note, I think it's time for us to begin wrapping up. One of the things that I'm fascinated about watching going forward is how the economy plays out, because I do think it's in pretty good shape. I'm fascinated that Biden hasn't been able to make the case, and that this makes this a jump ball in terms of an election, and whether people will ultimately, as we get closer and closer to Election Day, say, things are actually not that bad, so do we want to take a risk on going and on change? And I think that's where the Biden camp really believes the election is going to go. I think to their credit, I think they are remarkably confident that they think voters are going to come along and realize that they've done a pretty good job. I don't have their confidence, and I don't have the confidence that the numbers speak for themselves, or that people are going to respond in the way that they expect them to. Any last thoughts?
Well, the way you're saying it reminds me of the scriptural passage that says pride goes before a fall. So I think confidence could be extremely dangerous here. I think you're right. It's a jump ball situation at this point, and both candidates should be doing everything they can to get whatever advantage they can. It's really too early to predict.
Yeah. Well, thank you for your time. It's been great having this conversation with you. That's all we have for this episode.
Well, thanks, Kurt. It's been a pleasure.
Inside Political Science is a production from KAMU, Aggieland's Public Television and Radio. For more information, visit tx.ag/Inside Political Science. Have a question for our experts? Email them at insidepolicy@tamu.edu. Also, subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast platform so you never miss a new episode.